This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. We've been talking about ways and means of initiating not-for-profit organizations and looking at projects and trying to figure out how to get things underway. You start off with somebody with an idea, and then 2 or 3 people join and perhaps meet as a coffee group in the basement somewhere. And gradually you look for the concept that you might want to be dealing with. We've been dealing with 10 miles between Rantoul and Paxton. And there are other concepts too. This week we had a call from a wind farm in Piatt County that would like to see how they can work with trails in the area where they're establishing wind farms. They are north of Mansfield, but I was able to suggest that there's a potential rail trail coming in from Bloomington to Mansfield, and it's a rail trail with the rails removed and the ties removed. But the area from Mansfield into Champaign is a grain line that takes grain west to a north-south line, so that there is exit there. That means we have to think about how to get into Champaign using other means like country roads or perhaps other abandonments. And there are other associations which make it worthwhile to have an involvement. We don't always end up with a project. It may go to people who can do the job much better than we, but often we initiate and have been successful at doing so. But we spent about 10 years with the university in various ways to encourage environmental education, to work with artists and scientists and educators to establish a natural areas instructional development so we could encourage field trips. So we launched a reading the landscape class at Parkland. We would work with various departments and various local agencies to provide a slide or a set of slides or a personality or some help to elaborate a question. We were invited to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago by Jim Sansi so that we might do an artist in the landscape for many years. So the early stages involved talking back and forth. It involves regional planning because you need people, either a CEO or an organization like Regional Planning for East Central Illinois, to bring together all the niches and connections that might make it feasible for humans to hike and bike, but also for natural history organisms like birds and bees and Franklin ground squirrels and others to to move about the landscape and connect. It's amazing how some of these creatures do connect, but in many cases we're losing species because they don't have habitat in which to mate and survive and feed. So we spent quite a time working with various university departments and agencies like the Office of Instructional Resources and the early stages of environmental studies. And we had also been working a lot with the community. So the contingency money we were using cut out and we came to Champaign. And we settled on Market Street. And Market Street has been in its day a rather raunchy street. And I want to say something about the history of Champaign so you know where Market Street fits and how it relates to the railroad and how we can survive as a sort of alternate organization within the framework of a rapidly gentrifying downtown Champaign. We selected Market Street because it had 4 relatively empty buildings that used to belong to the J.R. Grubb Engraving Company. So we eventually rented and then bought one of those storefronts. And that is the question now, because we moved in when engraving was moving out. And we haven't done a lot to restore the buildings to a more modern code. For instance, the stair to go upstairs is a 30-stair straight stairwell. In these days, you would never do that. You would build a stairwell halfway up, then there'd be a landing, and then there would be another stairwell to the north, to the upstairs. That would be to allow people who had a heart situation or even didn't have a heart situation to rest a moment before they took the next step up. Our front facade needs tuck pointing. Some of our windows need replacing. So we've been using this area in the back blocks of Champaign. And we've been doing that for 50 years, half a century, without a lot of input from the city. But as buildings have been bought in downtown Champaign for upgrade and gentrification is going strong, then we look like country cousins. So thus the code warning that if we don't repair our building and bring it up to code, we can be in jeopardy of having the building demolished and replaced by a more modern building and a building that matched the growing facades of Market Street. Okay, well, you have to know some of the history of Champaign to be able to understand this. Early settlement was in Urbana. It was designed to be near Brownfield Woods. There were a little settlement there with a blacksmith and post office, and that was to be the place. But famously, there was a meeting of people who were interested in bringing the town near to where it is now in Urbana. The Busey family was one involved. And eventually that won through. So you have a banner, and very shortly the city county seat was installed there, and a county building was created rather quickly because the railroads were coming through, and the railroads chose to come through west of Urbana, and more where West Urbana was created, or Champaign as it is now known as. So Urbana had developed around the county seat, and it maintains that connection today. The county seat is there, and some of the older buildings have been replaced. There has been gentrification in Urbana too, but there is some character there. About 5 or 7 miles across the town, the area, east-west, West Urbana was growing. The railroad had come down in the late 1850s and eventually moved into Champaign. And it was rather a big project. The railroads were given land to build the railroad. They could sell the land, but they usually platted it to parallel the railroad line. The railroad line did not obey the fairly recently established north, south, east, west plat, known as the Jeffersonian plat, because he looked around and he knew various people from Europe who had bought land and they didn't know where to find it. The tree had died, the rock had rolled, or the landscape had changed. So Jefferson proposed this in north, south, east, west plat, which goes across the country. But when it encounters plats that are different, like the diagonal plat of the railroad Illinois Central at the time. So if you look around Champaign, you will see Flatiron buildings. You have to imagine that the household Flatiron has a point so it can warm and smooth dresses or shirts or what have you. So it's triangular. And so Flatiron buildings have often one side on the Jeffersonian plat and one side on the railroad plat. So if you go to a plastic company on First Street, you can see that the front door to the north is just a few feet wide, just enough to have a door and a pair of steps. But at the other end, it is probably about 30 odd feet wide, and the building is a Flatiron building. The city building itself is a Flatiron building. Well, so those procedures have their origin. When The railroad came through either for geological reasons or sometimes political reasons, sometimes a combination of both. The railroad came through basically on the Champagne Moraine rather than on the Yankee Ridge Moraine. And so early photographs will show you an older few buildings and eventually a formal railroad station, which survives today as Black Dog Saloon and restaurant just a few miles north. If you were standing on Heartland Pathways or Chestnut Street, which parallels, the railroad line was much closer to the Market Street than it is today. It had a grain elevator, it had lumber yards, and it had a place for you to obsquatulate. Obsquatulate was a word used by mainly Black conductors who would control the loading and unloading of passenger trains. It was an era word. But by the 1920s, Champagne had grown. It had grown out of having dirt streets, which in wet times were planked with wood so that you wouldn't get bogged down. But those planks were slippery and dangerous. So eventually the city was given a road base that was more responsible. And the streets were obeying that combination of Jeffersonian and railroad plats. Many of the buildings were wood buildings, and as they dried, especially in wintertime with heating, they were very prone to fire. So Champagne had a number of fires. The area near the railroad station, like Market Street, were places where there were lots of bars. There were billiard places. You can still see the billiards listed on the facade of buildings. They had coffee shops. But basically, it was a place where people came to enjoy themselves. A country person would come with a check for the work he'd done, bring horses, and the building that the News Gazette actually occupied was a 3-story harness factory. He would, and it was usually a he, put his harness in there for repair, put his horses in a livery stable, and began to enjoy himself downtown. There were starting price betting mechanisms behind coffee shops and other fronts. There were gaming of varying descriptions. There was a brothel or two. The one next door to us upstairs was a 30-bed brothel, and the madam would control it from a bar at that faced onto Market Street. We have known people who visited the brothel and knew its prices, whether it be by night or longer. We are aware that just across the street there was 2 stairwells that had been covered up with light wells, and we raked out of there a whole series of bottles and brandy and wine and what have you, where people probably used to sit and wait for service at the various places, including the brothel. We're waiting for someone to date and characterize those bottles. We still have them. The streetscape has been dealt with. It may have been lower, and the basement access would have been a little easier. But in its day, Market Street probably was a dirt street. The buildings began to go up. The one across the road has become Poor Brothers Bar. It was something like a 1923 building. Some of the bars to the north were replaced by a Lincoln building, which was designed mainly for lawyers and business people. So the office space is designed for that. Other buildings remained. One of them is established just on North Taylor Street and is kind of propped up because it hasn't been used for years. The Poor Bar was empty for a long time. The railroad was busy. It had come through and was headed for Cairo, and it was useful. The roads hadn't been developed yet, but there were up to over 20 trains a day. And this was a level crossing, and there were several lines. So it was decided that something should be done to provide an underpass or overpass for the growing number of T-model Fords and cars that were wanting to get across the level crossing without delay. At the same time, the trains were having difficulties getting over moraines, which were glacial features where melting glaciers dropped rock and rubble. And when the climate warmed and the glaciers retreated, it left a mountain or mound of glacial till or glacial rubble. The trains running from south to north had to negotiate these mounds. The same would happen from north to south, except that the tail off of the moraine is much more gentle to the north, and the trains could drop down over the heavier slope of the advanced side of the moraine. It was decided that there would have to be a helper train, a helper engine to push freight trains over the mound when they were going from south to north. And it was decided that they could carve a cutting through the moraine and allow the trains to go through without helpers and bring the soil down to Champaign to create a new railroad that was higher than before and high enough to allow an underpass to be scooped out underneath. The reform was not totally satisfactory because when you dig down to allow vehicles to go under the railroad line, the new railroad line, there's an accumulation of water, and that can sometimes deny traffic. The underpasses are also fairly low. So even in today, semi-trailers can get stuck in the underpass because they have a vehicle in front, a prime mover, which is higher, and a tail end of the semi up in the air, and the top is scraping on the roof of the underpass. Well, when you put in a new railroad, you don't waste time by denying one and creating the other and then putting the traffic back. So a new railroad was created further east of the old railroad, which came through about where the MTD building is now. The gravel was brought down, and some of the approach underpasses, like the one on Main Street, is not really tall enough to allow vehicles through. So it is a walking passage, but most of the other 6 underpasses are functional. In 1923 or somewhere around there, the little old railroad depot was skidded north and has now become a restaurant and Black Dog restaurant and bar. It took a little talent to do that, but the new building went in on space, and it was rather a large building with 3 floors and architecturally interesting. And it has remained, and it has also been replaced by an MTD, Mass Transit District building to the south, which functions as a combination for bringing rail and vehicles together. The area used to have an interurban, and that interurban also had to go underneath those to provide a access with the underpass. The interurban had to service Urbana because it was 5 or 7 miles away. Firstly, designed by as a horse-drawn vehicle, and later in the 1900s, it was run by electricity, but people had to get across from West Urbana to East Urbana. Later, the West Urbana was renamed Champaign. The railroads were also going east-west, so the Big Four came through from Danville to Champaign Urbana and went west. It was later taken over by the Illinois Central, but the elements of that are still there. In the 1860s, 70s, 80s, there were movements from the south of people who felt they could have a better life to the north. And they often settled in and around the railroads because there was often a leftover space where trains would intersect with each other, so a train from the Illinois Central could go to the Big Four. And there's a history there of gardens and early, sometimes patchwork buildings, but this is a rather separate African-American Black community where there was a family cohesion where the community would help to raise each other. And so it was a place of recognition and sometimes acceptance and sometimes of a little put down that has continued to today. The more affluent part of Champaign built around a West Side park. There were churches and buildings, and sometimes huge buildings were brought in. You have to remember that families were larger in those days, and so a big building was recognized. There has recently been a lot of debate about whether those buildings should be saved, because there's a debate between infill, like let's fill in the spaces downtown, rather than go out and spend money on infrastructure getting to a high school that might be out in the boondocks. So eventually the infill people won, and those that area lost some of its older buildings and an YMCA building, and infill has resulted. Packer of Preservation and Conservation Association has had a lot to do with the debate about that those buildings. The churches have sometimes moved. Baptist Church went to the south, and there was a Congregational Church, I think, but the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopalian Church, and Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, they're still there. There have been other buildings built around and facing the park. There was a Burnham Athenaeum, which was the public library. And so that gives you an idea of where early development started. Market Street was kind of a raunchy street. And Grandma didn't let the grandchildren go down to Market Street because it was a little raunchy. And it was well known. When the Grubb family of engravers moved in from Decatur, the area around Market and Walnut was still in rather relaxed state and small businesses, but it was obviously a place where the engraving company could initiate. That was in the middle 50s. After World War II, after a lot of citizens had come back from the war and they'd been driving tanks and airplanes, and they were ready to move and shake, and they were wanting to do interesting things in downtown Champaign. So there was more planning, and the old theaters were that were proscenium stage theaters where a team of people could kick their legs up, but not big enough for a lot of actual theater. The Virginia Theater has been saved, and other theaters are have the elements. The Orpheum is still a possible reconstruction theater. Uh, so there was lots of traffic in downtown Champaign. There were trams, trams being a little bit different from interurbans. Interurban is a bigger train, still only a couple of cars, but you had to negotiate with modern vehicles in the 20s and 30s on the side, and tram tracks usually down the middle. And these were popular. They moved people in a time when there were not a lot of buses, and there was a need to get from one place to another. And so we have these remnants of tracks. An element of the tracks into Urbana were exposed recently, and you could see the tracks where the intercity trolley car, or not trolley car, but a railroad, could turn around in front of the courthouse. Now, when we came to this area, it had further decomposed. In the 50s, the engraving company was growing. It gradually occupied 8 of the buildings in the complex. I have to explain that as fires destroyed buildings that were wooden, the city decided to replace them with 2 series of 100-foot long brick buildings. So the buildings that we occupy, which is Weft and Heartland Pathways and other stores, were 8, about 25 feet wide, and nested together between Taylor Street and Chestnut. And there was an equivalent row of buildings on Walnut Street with a 40-foot alley in between. The alleyway had been vacated, and the Grubb family buildings built over the alleyway, and were on both the Market Street side and the Walnut Street side. By the 60s, you were getting out of linotype. At one stage, you could walk up Market Street and look in the window of the News Gazette building, which replaced the old harness factory, and you could see a gentleman working at a linotype machine. The linotype machine did clickety-clack, click-clack, click-clack, and would produce a lead letter, which could be pushed together to make a lead word. And there were journeymen who were knowledgeable about doing this. So they would make up a letterpress page. And if that letterpress page had to go elsewhere, you didn't send a lead copy. You made a paper mache copy and sent the paper mache copy to Seeker or wherever. And the local press there would have an ability to pour lead into the paper mache and create a different page. And from that, they would print. So this technology was being replaced by offset press. And offset press and rotogravure were technological developments where you could print, depending on the miscibility of oil and water, you could have plates that could be printed from using appropriate inks, and once again, journeyman, but not quite the journeyman that you needed for photograving work. The Grubb family did not print. They may have printed some things, but basically they were proof presses that they owned. And right next door to Weft at Heartland Pathways, upstairs, there were two proof presses. These were 1946 proof presses, and you could run letterpress on them, but usually it was plates about 2 feet by 3 feet, a copper or zinc plate. And these presses were taken up into the building. They took off a balcony or a jut out architectural feature and rolled the presses in on very small rollers. Established them. There were two, so you could do 2 plates, 3 different colors and black, and you had those 4 images could be combined to proof the engraving that you made. The presses were Rolls-Royce in style, and they needed journeymen to work them. They also needed to be very flat, so they had a bed that was 10 inches deep and about 10 feet long and about 4 feet wide, and absolutely stable, so you didn't get any press parts moving around. There was still the possibility that your press plate would move a little, would have humps under some parts and low spots. So they had a special Thermopax machine, which would create little mountains that, or depressions that were counterpart to what was actual on the plate. And you could make that little mountain and put it underneath the plate so it could be kissed by the roller that was rolling over it to make a print. This sort of machine is wonderful for artists who are doing print work. It sits, but is actually unfortunate that the Grubb family business had a fire elsewhere and took out the 3-phase motor. So the 3-phase motor that is used to gently move the roller over the plate and press the paper into the ink very gently, not too much so it gets fuzzy, but just right. That's still there. And evil-mindedly, we're thinking that if you're going to develop downtown Champaign further and do gentrification, there is a role for artists and alternate organizations to exist. Weft has done it very well. They're 40 years old and they've been surviving. They do it without any management being paid. Volunteers do a lot of work, and some volunteers do more than others. But we have the evil thought that the building just north of them could become a visual building, a media building, because most people are involved with media. If I go to a natural area study group field trip, then most everyone is carrying a camera, whether it be a cell phone or more likely a single lens reflex. Those people have computers and can look up imagery that is exciting and what we need to tell people, because we can't always take people 20 miles to a prairie. And when we get there, it's not so interesting because it kind of looks like weeds, and a forest is much more interesting. You can hug it, but and the prairie may have chiggers and may have the ticks, and we all know that. But this is our heritage. This is what was here. It was very little forest. 94% of our county was prairie. It's very good soil underneath it. The prairie has helped to mature it, and from glacial till, and it's very productive for agriculture, whether that be early livestock or later row crops. So every inch is valuable. So we think that there ought to be in downtown Champaign a visual place. And it takes talent. It takes time. It's a different cat than doing a radio station, although a radio station is also very instrumental in bringing people a concept that they have to imagine and enjoy. It's the two medium are essential and wonderful. But so we haven't done much with the building. We're loaded with artifacts. There has been a recycling center years ago, but it was let to grow down, and there has been public and private recycling, but a lot of recyclable materials go into the landfill in Clinton, 40 miles away. Over time, I've helped to remove up to about 100 tons of recyclable material, repairable material. That brings me to another topic. The old town had people like Paul Audubon, who had parts for all the appliances that you could imagine. They had them stacked to the roof, but it was not it was a dangerous situation for a fire. It was not meeting code. And so eventually Paul was eliminated, and his replacements were given orders to remove themselves from the basement. So the heaters had to come up on a nice space on the floor above. We're fairly familiar with those sorts of desires to have physical safety. But in the process, we have salvaged a lot of things. A lot of our furniture came from when the major business people moved out of town. Sears Roebuck and Penny's moved. They moved to the mall, leaving the city somewhat dead. The city decided to put in a mall. So they closed off Neal Street and put in a mall that went down to Chestnut. And it cost $1 million to put it in. The traffic, which came through from 74 going straight south, had to find its way through places like Market Street and the like. So I can remember salvaging from Penny's as they closed out. I would work on the dumpsters overnight. I would have to share Fremont Street with a gang of prostitutes. So we were both working the night together, but doing different things. And salvage was in there. And so we have salvage stored in this building, whether it be a closeout of a estate sale that didn't know what to do with valuable stuff. I just opened a suitcase with 3 quilts that are heritage from over by Riverton near Springfield. And Mary Hussey died, and that is the sort of thing. It takes time to move it around. Does this quilt go to the Cunningham Children's Home, where they give quilts to orphans? Or does it go to the Banner Free Library? Or does it go to the Prairie Museum in Muhammad? It takes time to work out. It takes time for people to come and have a look at what you have, whether it be crockery from the southern tea rooms, or boots, or shirts, or things that steel we can get rid of to places like Max for recycle. But it takes time to do this, and we haven't been very worried about upgrading the buildings. So thus we have to think about how you handle some of these things. We are at one time trying to inspire the Department of Transportation to take over or develop a roadside prairie between Rantoul and Paxton, and at the other time trying to save our souls. So this gets back to what you do with that 3-person people who decide to do something interesting in their lives and bring together a community. It's obvious that it happens. The Grand Prairie Friends has taken off. They've done very well, and totally with themselves. The Natural Areas Study Group has done the same. Sometimes Heartland Pathways has put in trails, and it's preserved prairie. There is a lot of things to do at once, and how can we placate the code management, which has its job to do? And so one of the answers to doing that is to create a fundraising event. It's not for any one thing, it's for a number of things. And we haven't asked the public a lot to do that. But if you were thinking of establishing a bee colony, or something that you wanted to do publicly, then you would have to think about, do you have a storage house for a vehicle? We have just lost 2 vehicles, but we've been given 2 vehicles that we park nearby, and we would like to reserve this site and Weft and others as a part of the development of Champaign. If the south of the University Avenue that are moved to put in a ice hockey arena that would be big enough to encourage events to come to town, and have surrounding hotels and facilities that would make an event possible. At the present time, Champaign is considered too small to handle big events. Allerton Park has the same problem. Banner, I'm sure, has the same problem. But if you're going to do that and invite people in, people aren't always their one domain. They want to know who you are, what you are, where you are, and you need a balance of these sorts of organizations. So we have to say, it's what's in this building that's important. It's the archives that we can eventually take to the Banner Free Library, or for the Price Paint Store, which was the oldest DuPont paint store in Champaign, and they've taken them and welcome. It may be for music that has gone to the Sousa Foundation at the university. These elements are here. It's very easy to close out such buildings and to demolish them and replace them with a bar or another building. And they don't look exactly like a modern building would look like. We look like an antique store after all. And that's sort of what we are. And people come in and people enjoy, and there's a camaraderie, and we would like to encourage that. So in the next future, you may see another example of one aspect of how to put together a community not-for-profit organization and see it work, but not be afraid to see it not work, but perhaps contribute in a small way here and there. I think I'm watching at the clock. It's about time for me to scoot, and thanks for listening. And think about Market Street as it has grown into a more modern street, but the city would like to maintain its character, its history. It was a wonderful street in its day, and it has lots of character, and it should retain some of that character. Thanks for listening. Support WEFT. It's helped us a lot. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.